The auctioneer's hammer was about to fall when she stepped forward. Caleb Shaw stood on that wooden platform in the town square, hands bound, watching his life being sold to the highest bidder. At 19, he was about to become property payment for his dead father's gambling debts. The morning sun beat down on Millfield's dusty main street as curious townspeople gathered around the makeshift auction block. Caleb tried to keep his head up, but shame burned through him like wildfire. He'd never even kissed a girl, never held a woman's hand, and now he was being sold like livestock to work off $800 his father owed to Vincent Cray, the most ruthless loan shark in 3 counties. Cray stood near the platform, gold tooth glinting as he smiled. The man enjoyed watching families destroyed by debt. 3 bidders had shown interest. Old man Peterson, who needed workers for his brutal copper mine. Jake Morrison, whose ranch hands rarely lasted more than 6 months. And surprisingly, a woman Caleb didn't recognize. She wore a dark blue dress, practical but well-made, with auburn hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat. Her green eyes studied Caleb with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She looked to be in her late 20s, with calloused hands that spoke of hard work. Yet she carried herself with quiet confidence. $200. Peterson called out, his voice gravely from years of shouting orders in the mines. $250, Morrison countered, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. The woman raised her hand. $300. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Women didn't typically bid at debt auctions, especially not against established men. Caleb found himself staring at her, wondering what she could possibly want with him. $350. Peterson growled, clearly annoyed by the competition. Without hesitation, she responded, $500. The crowd fell silent. That was more than most men earned in a year. Peterson shook his head and walked away, muttering under his breath. Morrison looked uncertain, glancing between his remaining money and the mysterious woman. Caleb watched this stranger bidding on his future, his heart pounding. He knew nothing about her, not her name, her intentions, or why she seemed willing to pay so much for a boy who'd never done a hard day's work in his life. $500 going once the auctioneer announced hammer raised. Morrison started to raise his hand, then thought better of it and stepped back. Going twice, the woman's eyes met Caleb's across the crowd. For a moment, something passed between them. Not pity, but something else he couldn't identify. It felt like she was seeing him as a person, not just another debt to be settled. Sold to the lady for $500, the hammer fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Caleb's chest. The crowd began to disperse, but he remained frozen on the platform, staring at the woman who now owned him. She approached slowly, pulling a leather pouch from her coat. Vincent Cray counted out the money with obvious satisfaction. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am. Hope you get your money's worth out of the boy." She handed over the coins without taking her eyes off Caleb. "I intend to." As the ropes around his wrists were cut, Caleb rubbed the raw skin and tried to understand what had just happened. This woman had saved him from the mines or Morrison's brutal ranch. But at what cost? What did she expect from him? She stepped closer, and he caught the scent of lavender and leather. "My name is Clara Delmont. You'll be coming with me." But as she turned to leave, Caleb noticed something that made his blood run cold. 3 men on horseback sat at the edge of town, watching the proceedings with dangerous interest. And he was certain he'd seen the same men following Vincent Cray around town for the past week. Clara's wagon moved steadily down the dirt road leading out of Millfield. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. He sat beside her on the wooden bench, stealing glances at the woman who'd just bought his freedom, or perhaps his servitude. She handled the reins with practiced ease. Her attention focused on the path ahead. The silence stretched between them until Caleb finally found his voice. "Ma'am, I need to ask, what exactly do you expect from me?" Clara didn't look at him immediately. "Can you read and write?" The question caught him off guard. Yes, ma'am. My mother taught me before she died. Good, can you handle livestock? Some, we had a few chickens and a milk cow before. He trailed off, not wanting to mention his father's drinking and gambling. Before your father lost everything to Vincent Cray, she finished matter-of-factly. I know the story. Caleb, half the county knows how Harold Shaw drank away his farm and left his son to pay the price. Heat rushed to Caleb's face. The shame of his family's reputation followed him everywhere. Yes, ma'am. Clara finally turned to study him, and he was struck again by those piercing green eyes. I'm not interested in your father's mistakes. I'm interested in whether you're willing to work hard and learn. I am, he said quickly. Whatever you need, I'll do it. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. We'll see about that. As they crested a hill, Caleb got his first glimpse of Clara's property. The ranch spread out below them like something from a dream. Rolling pastures dotted with cattle, a sturdy two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and several well-maintained outbuildings. This wasn't the modest homestead he'd expected. This is all yours? He asked, unable to hide his amazement. Every acre, Clara replied with obvious pride. Built it with my late husband over 8 years. Been running it alone for the past 2. Caleb did quick calculations in his head. For a woman barely older than himself to own such a prosperous ranch was almost unheard of. Most widows sold out and moved back with family. How do you manage it all by yourself? Clara's expression hardened slightly. Carefully, and with help when I can find workers who don't think a woman can't tell a bull from a steer, they approached the house. And Caleb noticed how well everything was maintained. The fences were straight and strong. The barn roof showed recent repairs, and the cattle looked healthy and well fed. This woman clearly knew what she was doing. But as Clara brought the wagon to a stop near the house, Caleb spotted something that made his stomach clench. Fresh wagon tracks in the dirt tracks that didn't match Clara's wagon. And they led right up to the front porch. Someone's been here, he said quietly. Clara followed his gaze and went very still. Her hand moved instinctively to something beneath her coat, the outline of a small pistol. Stay close to me, she whispered, and don't do anything heroic. They climbed down from the wagon cautiously. The front door stood slightly ajar, though Caleb was certain Clara would have locked it before leaving for town. A breeze stirred the curtains in an upstairs window that should have been closed. Clara drew her pistol, holding it low but ready. Caleb, I need you to walk behind me and keep your eyes on those trees over there. If you see any movement, you tell me immediately. As they approached the house, Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd been bought, and now possibly walked into some kind of danger, all in the same day. But something about the way Clara moved, confident and alert, made him feel oddly safe, despite the circumstances. They reached the porch steps when Clara suddenly stopped. There, carved into the wooden railing, were fresh letters, "Pay up." But that wasn't what made Caleb's blood freeze. It was the realization that the 3 men from town hadn't been watching the auction out of curiosity. They'd been watching to see who would buy him. Clara pushed the front door open with her boot pistol raised. The house was eerily quiet, but Caleb could smell something wrong. The lingering scent of unwashed men and tobacco. They definitely had visitors. The main room showed signs of a search. Drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, cushions overturned. But it wasn't random destruction. Whoever had been here was looking for something specific. They wanted me to know they'd been here, Clara whispered, lowering her weapon slightly. Otherwise, they would have been more careful. Caleb bent to pick up some of the scattered papers, but Clara caught his wrist. Her touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, the first time a woman had ever touched him with anything other than maternal affection from his late mother. Don't touch anything yet, she said softly. We need to see what they were after. They moved through the house methodically. The kitchen had been ransacked, but the expensive china remained untouched. In Clara's office, the safe stood open, but apparently empty. Upstairs, her bedroom showed signs of a thorough search, though her jewelry box sat undisturbed on the dresser. "They weren't here to rob you," Caleb observed, trying to ignore how intimate it felt to be in her private space. Clara nodded grimly. They were looking for papers, probably land deeds or financial records. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. The question is whether they found what they wanted. Caleb studied her profile as she watched the tree line. The afternoon light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, and he found himself noticing the determined set of her jaw, the elegant line of her neck. He'd never been alone with a woman like this, beautiful, capable, mysterious. It made him acutely aware of his own inexperience. "Why did you really buy me?" he asked suddenly. Clara turned from the window, and for a moment her carefully controlled expression slipped. He caught a glimpse of something vulnerable, underneath loneliness perhaps, or fear she was trying not to show. "Because I needed help," she said simply. "And because you looked like someone who deserved a chance." "But $500, that's more than most men are worth." A bitter smile crossed her face. "Most men around here think I'm worth less than that, a woman running a ranch alone. They've been waiting 2 years for me to fail and sell out cheap." Caleb was beginning to understand. The men who broke in, they're not just random thieves. No, they're not. Clara moved to a chest in the corner and pulled out a rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. There are people who want this land, Caleb, and they're not particular about how they get it. She handed him the rifle, and he took it with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the trust she was showing him. "Can you use this? My father taught me to hunt before he..." Caleb straightened his shoulders. "Yes, ma'am. I can shoot." "Good, because those men will be back." Clara began gathering the scattered papers, her movements efficient and practiced. And next time they won't be satisfied with just searching. As Caleb helped her restore order to the room, he couldn't help but admire how she handled the situation. No tears, no panic, just determined action. He'd never met a woman like her, strong, independent, unafraid to face danger head-on. But as they worked, he noticed something that made his chest tight with concern. Clara kept touching her left shoulder, wincing slightly when she thought he wasn't looking. And when she bent to pick up a fallen book, he saw a dark stain on the back of her dress that definitely hadn't been there at the auction. She was bleeding and trying to hide it from him. Caleb couldn't stay silent any longer. "Clara, you're hurt." She froze in the middle of straightening an overturned chair. "What are you talking about?" "Your dress, there's blood on the back." He set down the papers he'd been organizing and moved toward her. "When did this happen?" Clara's hand flew to her shoulder, and she winced at her own touch. "It's nothing serious, just a scratch." From what Caleb's voice carried more authority than he'd ever used with anyone, especially a woman who owned him. But seeing her in pain triggered something protective he didn't know he possessed. For a moment, Clara looked like she might refuse to answer. Then her shoulders sagged slightly. And suddenly, she looked less like the confident woman who dominated that auction and more like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden alone for too long. "There was a fourth man," she admitted, quietly waiting by my wagon when I came out of the general store before the auction. He had a knife, wanted to know where I kept my land papers. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest, not embarrassment this time, but anger. "He cut you." I fought back, got away, but not before he... She gestured vaguely at her shoulder. "Like I said, it's just a scratch." "Let me see." Clara's eyes widened. "Caleb, that's not appropriate." Appropriate. Caleb stepped closer, and she seemed surprised by the intensity in his voice. "You bought me to help you, right? Well, this is me helping. That wound could get infected, and then where would we be?" For a long moment they stared at each other. Caleb was acutely aware of how close they stood, how he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, how her breath caught slightly when he moved nearer. But underneath the sudden tension between them was something more urgent. She was hurt and trying to hide it. Clara seemed to be fighting some internal battle. Finally, she nodded toward the kitchen. "There's a medical kit in the pantry and hot water on the stove." As Caleb gathered the supplies, his hands shook slightly. He'd never tended a woman's wound before, never been in such an intimate situation with anyone. But Clara needed help, and there was no one else. When he returned, Clara had removed her outer dress and sat in her chemise and corset, her injured shoulder exposed. The cut was deeper than she'd admitted, a long angry slash that had bled considerably. "This is more than a scratch," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady as he cleaned the wound. "You should have gone to the doctor and told him what that men are threatening me for my land." Clara's jaw was tight, whether from pain or frustration. He couldn't tell. Dr. Morrison would have that information spread around town before nightfall. "Half these men want to see me fail." Caleb worked carefully, acutely aware of her sharp intake of breath when he touched the tender area. "Why haven't you sold out, left for somewhere safer?" "Because this is mine." The fierce pride in her voice made him look up. "My husband and I built this place from nothing. We dreamed about passing it on to our children someday." "Children," the word slipped out before Caleb could stop it. Clara's expression softened, becoming sad in a way that made his chest ache. "We tried for 5 years, lost 3 babies before they could even—" She stopped, shaking her head. "When Samuel died in that riding accident, I thought about leaving. But this ranch is all I have left of those dreams." Caleb continued bandaging her shoulder, but his mind was reeling. This strong, capable woman had endured more loss than most people faced in a lifetime, yet she kept fighting. "That's why you need help," he said quietly. "Real help, not just someone to buy." Clara turned to face him, and suddenly they were very close. "Caleb, you need to understand something. The men who want this land, they won't stop at intimidation. If you were Caleb, what would you do? Promise to stay and fight beside her, knowing you could both die or convince her to sell and leave for somewhere safe? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you choose. Because what Caleb decided next would determine whether either of them lived to see another sunrise. Caleb looked into Clara's eyes, seeing the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "I'm not going anywhere." The words came out stronger than he felt. But once he said them, he knew they were true. This woman had saved him from a life of brutal labor. But more than that, she'd given him purpose. For the first time since his mother died, someone needed him. Clara studied his face as if trying to determine whether he meant it. "Caleb, you don't understand what you're saying. These men will kill you without a second thought. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get the chance." Caleb finished securing the bandage on her shoulder, his fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. "Tell me everything. Who wants your land and why?" Clara pulled her dress back on, slowly wincing as the fabric touched her injured shoulder. "There's a cattle baron named Marcus Steele. He owns most of the rangeland from here to the state line. But my property sits right in the middle of his holdings. So he wants to buy you out. He's offered me half what the land's worth, then a quarter." Clara moved to the window again, checking the approaching dusk. "When I refused to sell, the accident started. Cattle found dead with no explanation. Fences cut, workers scared off with threats." Caleb felt pieces clicking into place. "Vincent Cray works for Steele's Smart Boy." Clara turned back to him with approval. "Cray loans money to desperate farmers, then sells their debts to Steele when they can't pay. Your father wasn't the first man to lose everything that way." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. His father's gambling addiction hadn't been random bad luck. It had been orchestrated. They targeted him specifically, I think so. Your family's old homestead borders my southern pasture. If Steele owned both properties, Clara shrugged, then immediately regretted the movement. Caleb felt rage building in his chest, but alongside it came something else. Determination. What do you need me to do? Clara seemed surprised by his calm acceptance. Can you ride hard, shoot straight, think fast when men are trying to kill you? I guess we'll find out. Despite everything, Clara smiled. You're braver than you know, Caleb Shaw. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses reached them through the evening air. Clara grabbed her rifle and moved to the window, Caleb close behind with his weapon ready. 3 riders approached the house at a steady pace, making no attempt at stealth. The same men from town, Caleb realized, plus 2 others he didn't recognize. All armed, all wearing the hard expressions of men comfortable with violence. Clara Delmont, one of them called out. We need to talk. Clara checked her rifle's chamber. That's Buck Harrison Steele's foreman. Whatever they want, it's not conversation. Caleb positioned himself at a second window, trying to control his racing heart. He'd never been in a real fight, never faced armed men who wanted to hurt him. But as he watched Clara prepare to defend her home, he felt something shift inside him. We know you're in there, woman. Harrison's voice carried across the yard. Come out peaceful, and maybe we won't burn the place down around you. Clara looked at Caleb, and he saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. Not fear, not desperation, but trust. She was counting on him. Mrs. Delmont Harrison called again. You've got 10 seconds to show yourself, or we're coming in. Caleb glanced at Clara, who nodded grimly. But as they prepared to face whatever came next, neither of them noticed the 6th man creeping around toward the back door. The same man who'd cut Clara earlier, still carrying his bloody knife. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will change everything between Clara and Caleb forever. The back door creaked open just as Harrison finished his countdown. Clara spun toward the sound, but Caleb was already moving. The man with the knife stepped into the kitchen, eyes scanning for targets, when Caleb brought his rifle butt down hard across the intruder's skull. The man dropped like a stone, his knife clattering across the floor. Nice work, Clara whispered. But there was no time to celebrate. Harrison's voice boomed from the front yard. Time's up, woman. Boys, let's smoke them out. Through the front window, Caleb watched 2 men dismount and approach with torches. Clara took careful aim and fired her shot, shattering a water trough near the horses. The animals reared and scattered, and the men dove for cover. Warning shot, she told Caleb. Next ones won't be. Caleb had never heard a woman talk about shooting men so matter-of-factly. But as he watched her reload with practiced efficiency, he realized Clara had been preparing for this confrontation for months, maybe years. Clara Harrison shouted from behind an overturned wagon. Send out the boy, and we'll make this quick for you. The boy, they wanted him specifically. Caleb felt a chill as he understood. Buying him at auction had marked Clara as his protector. By saving him, she'd made herself an even bigger target. I'm sorry, he whispered to her. This is my fault. Clara's green eyes flashed. Don't you dare. This started long before you came along. A torch sailed through the air, landing on the front porch. Flames began licking at the wooden planks. Another torch followed this one, breaking through a downstairs window and setting the curtains ablaze. We need to get out of here, Clara said, coughing as smoke began filling the room. But as they gathered their weapons and what supplies they could carry, Caleb realized something that made his stomach drop. Clara, where are your horses? Her face went pale. In the barn, they wouldn't have. She looked toward the back of the house, where an orange glow was already visible through the windows. They're burning everything. The sound of crackling flames was growing louder, and smoke was making it hard to breathe. Caleb grabbed Clara's hand the first time he'd initiated contact with her and pulled her toward the stairs. "The roof," he said. "Is there a way onto the roof?" Clara nodded, leading him up to the second floor. In her bedroom, she pushed open a window that led to a section of roof over the kitchen. But as they climbed out, Caleb could see the full scope of their situation. The barn was engulfed in flames, and he could hear the terrified screaming of trapped horses. The front porch was burning steadily, and more torches were being prepared. Harrison's men had positioned themselves to cover all the obvious escape routes. "They planned this," Clara said, her voice tight with anguish, as she watched her life's work being destroyed. "They never intended to just talk." Caleb studied the yard, looking for any opportunity. The well stood about 30 yards from the house, offering the only real cover between them and the tree line. But it might as well have been 30 miles with armed men watching every angle. Then he noticed something the attackers had missed. Clara's root cellar sat near the back of the property, its entrance hidden by a small rise in the ground. If they could reach it. "Clara, the cellar doesn't connect to anything. There's a tunnel Samuel dug during the first year. It leads to the creek about a quarter-mile downstream." Her eyes widened as she understood his plan. "But we'd have to cross open ground to reach it." Caleb checked his rifle, then looked at the woman beside him. Her face was streaked with smoke and tears. For her burning home, her dead horses, the life she was watching disappear. But her hands were steady on her weapon. "When I start shooting, you run for that cellar," he told her. "Don't look back. Don't wait for me." Clara grabbed his arm. "Caleb, Mo, you'll never make it to cover." "Maybe not, but you will." For a moment she stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then, to his complete shock, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was quick, desperate tasting of smoke and fear. But it was the first kiss of his life. "Don't you dare die on me, Caleb Shaw," she whispered against his lips. But as Caleb prepared to sacrifice himself to save her, neither of them saw Harrison's final man emerging from the trees directly between them and the cellar. Caleb spotted the gunman. At the same moment, the man raised his rifle toward Clara. Without thinking, Caleb threw himself off the roof, tackling the shooter, just as his weapon discharged. They hit the ground hard, rolling in the dirt as they fought for control of the gun. The man was bigger, stronger. But Caleb fought with the desperation of someone protecting the first person who'd ever believed in him. He managed to wrench the rifle away and swing it like a club, connecting with the man's temple. The gunman went limp. Clara dropped from the roof behind him, landing with a grunt of pain as her injured shoulder hit the ground. "Are you hurt?" He helped her to her feet, acutely aware of how close they stood, how her body trembled against his. "I'm fine, but we need to move." Now they ran across the open ground toward the cellar, expecting bullets to find them at any moment. But Harrison's remaining men were focused on the burning house, apparently believing their targets were still trapped inside. Clara yanked open the cellar door, revealing wooden steps leading down into darkness. They descended quickly, Caleb pulling the door shut behind them just as shouts erupted from the yard. Someone had found their unconscious companion. The cellar was cramped and musty, filled with preserved goods and farming supplies. But at the far end, partially hidden behind sacks of grain, Caleb could see the entrance to Samuel's tunnel. "This way," Clara whispered, leading him into the narrow passage that her late husband had carved through earth and stone. They crawled through the tunnel in darkness, Clara ahead of him, both trying to move quietly despite their urgency. The space was barely wide enough for one person, and Caleb found himself acutely aware of Clara's proximity. The sound of her breathing, the brush of her skirt against his hands. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, they emerged near the creek bank, hidden by tall grass and overhanging willows. Behind them, they could see the orange glow of the burning ranch, hear the distant shouts of frustrated men searching for their escaped prey. Clara sank to her knees beside the water, and for the first time since he'd met her, she looked defeated. Her home was gone, her livestock dead, her life's work reduced to ashes. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly, kneeling beside her. "This is all because of me." Clara turned to look at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "No, Caleb, this was always going to happen. You just gave me a reason to fight back instead of running." "What do we do now?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, staring at the water flowing past their feet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that surprised him. "We go to the territorial marshal in Carson City. I've been gathering evidence of Steele's land grabbing for months. With tonight's attack, we finally have enough to bring him down. That's a 2-day ride through dangerous country, I know." Clara stood brushing dirt from her dress. "And Steele's men will be hunting us every mile of the way." Caleb rose beside her, studying her profile in the moonlight. "Clara, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said before." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart race. "What is it? Caleb struggled with words he'd never said to anyone. "When you kissed me back there, it wasn't just fear or desperation. At least not for me." Clara stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, even in the dim light. What was it then? But before Caleb could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the direction of the burning ranch. Harrison's men had found their trail. Clara grabbed Caleb's hand and pulled him deeper into the creek bed, using the water to mask their tracks. They moved as quietly as possible, staying low among the reeds and cattails that lined the bank. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by Harrison's angry voice, directing his men to spread out and search both sides of the creek. Caleb could hear them thrashing through the underbrush, getting nearer with each passing minute. "There," Clara whispered, pointing to a fallen log that had created a small pool downstream. "We can hide underneath." They waded toward the makeshift shelter, the cold water soaking through their clothes. Just as they ducked under, the log torchlight flickered across the water where they'd been standing moments before. "I know you're out here somewhere," Harrison shouted. "Steele's offering $1,000 for the woman dead or alive, and $500 for the boy." Pressed against Caleb in the cramped space beneath the log, Clara's body was warm despite the cold water. He could feel her heart beating rapidly against his chest. Could smell the faint scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite everything they'd been through. "Caleb," she whispered so quietly he could barely hear her. "What you were going to say before I love you." The words came out in a rush, surprising them both. "I know it's crazy. I know I'm just some inexperienced boy you bought at auction." But Clara silenced him with another kiss, longer this time, deeper. When they broke apart, her eyes were bright with tears. "It's not crazy," she whispered, "and you're not just some boy. You're the man who stayed to fight for me when anyone with sense would have run." The searchers moved past their hiding spot, but Caleb barely noticed. Clara's confession filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with their shared body heat. "When we get to Carson City," he said quietly, "after we testify against Steele. What happens then?" Clara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the auction. "Then we figure out how to rebuild together if you want." "I want." They waited another hour before emerging from their hiding place, soaked and shivering, but alive. The pursuit had moved on, giving them a chance to put distance between themselves and Harrison's men. As they walked through the pre-dawn darkness toward the main road, Clara slipped her hand into his. "Caleb, there's something you should know. When I saw you on that auction block, it wasn't just pity that made me bid." "What was it?" "You looked like someone who understood loss, someone who'd fight for something worth having." Clara squeezed his hand. "I was right." 3 days later, they stood in the territorial marshal's office in Carson City, watching as arrest warrants were issued for Marcus Steele Buck Harrison and Vincent Cray. Clara's carefully preserved evidence, combined with testimony from other victims, was enough to bring down the entire land-grabbing operation. But the real victory came 6 months later, when Caleb stood beside Clara on the porch of their rebuilt home, watching the sunset paint their restored ranch in shades of gold. The young man who'd been sold like livestock had become a partner in one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Clara leaned against his shoulder, her wedding ring catching the last light of day. "No regrets about missing out on your freedom." Caleb wrapped his arms around his wife, thinking about the scared, inexperienced boy who'd stood on that auction block. "Freedom isn't about being alone," he said quietly. "It's about choosing who you want to belong to." Clara turned in his arms, and he saw their future reflected in her green eyes. Years of working side by side, building something lasting together. Maybe even the children they both dreamed of. Sometimes the best things in life came from the worst circumstances. Sometimes being sold was really being saved. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel because we've got more incredible tales of love, courage, and redemption from the Old West. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.